Welcome to the History of the Papacy Podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. And now, with the History of the Papacy diptychs, we have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Alex, Augustus, and Judy. At the Constantinople, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the History of the Popes of Rome and Christian Church. In the year of King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations of it be firmly laid. Its height 60 cubits, its width 60 cubits, 4 with 3 rows of heavy stones and 1 row of new timber. Let the expenses be paid from the king's treasury. Also, let the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple which is in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and taken back to the temple which is in Jerusalem, each to its place, and deposit them in the house of God. Book of Ezra, chapter 6, verses 3 through 5, New King James Version, from BibleGateway.com. Steve here again, and we are talking about a topic that is one of my favorites, the Second Temple of Jerusalem. It's just a fascinating topic, and it's endless, and it just keeps taking us back to more and more themes that we talk about in this entire podcast. You don't have a Popes of Rome and a Christian church without the Second Temple of Jerusalem. Now, this quote really summarizes the episode for today. There was a temple in Jerusalem. It was destroyed and built again. And then the rest of the story was it was destroyed again. And pretty much that's the end. But of course, there is much more to the story. We are going to take a really short trip into the history of the Temple of Jerusalem. I didn't do the data exactly, but in 10 years of making the History of the Papacy, I've probably mentioned the Temple of Jerusalem hundreds, if not thousands of times. And this whole purpose of this 10th anniversary special is to explore the Second Temple roots of Christianity. Let's take a quick tour through the history of the Temple of Jerusalem. And then, this episode is really a very high flyover. Like going, an example of this I can think of is a fellow history podcaster that many of you will know, hopefully most of you will know, is Professor James Early. We went recently, we went twice to the World War II in the Pacific Museum, not too far from where I live. And the first time we went, we only got through about a third of the museum, and that was taking a high level flyover. And then we went and we finished about the rest of the 2/3, half of the museum another day. And that was a super flyover. And this is probably going to be even a little longer than a super flyover, but we're going to try. We can definitely get into details, especially if there's specifics you're interested in, like temple services, the first temple, scriptures, the destruction. We can get into all of that. But let's start off with the Temple of Jerusalem and building a tradition and building an institution. The temple is much more of a concept than a physical building. Think of a court. It's much more than the benches and the rails and etc. The court represents the very idea of law and order. Just like the church, it represents the entire institution of Christianity, not just a building. We lose perspective of buildings representing authority and institutions, but it's a really important concept. The temple was the center of the universe for most Jews. I say most because, as we know, there were many Jews and many different Judaisms. Different groups had different ideas, even as different temples. Examples are the Samaritans. Their temple was many miles north in something called Mount Gerizim. The Essenes, or the Dead Sea sect, or the Qumran sect, if you prefer, weren't big fans of the temple at all. Most Jews of any sect, really, the temple was the center of their religious life, no matter if they lived in Judea, Babylon, Rome, or anywhere in between. The temple was a building, but it was also a theological and ontological symbol for an entire group of people. It was where the transcendent God actually interfaced with humanity. Where there's a second temple, there was a first temple. Let's talk about the first temple of Jerusalem. This is a big story in short form. Now, some of the history of the city of Jerusalem and the founding of the city of Jerusalem is just lost to time and legend. People argue about the historical Jesus, but what about the historical King David? Forget about it. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors. The biblical story of Jerusalem and why they put a temple there goes all the way back to Abraham and a certain priest king of the Most High God named Melchizedek. Melchizedek is probably the most mentioned yet least known character in the Bible. How was a guy living in a pagan land, king of a random Canaanite city, a high priest of the Most God? The short, the sweet, and the complete deflection answer is that this is a topic for a different day, and I might actually get into that because I'm fascinated to do a deep dive on that subject. But it shows that this location of Jerusalem was really important to the early Old Testament writers and compilers. Whatever the case, Jerusalem was fairly prosperous, at least well-established Canaanite town with a really strong religious cult. King David set up his capital in Jerusalem, a model city for a great king, a common move for kings of that day. Archaeology confirms and denies some of the Davidic story of the Old Testament. but it's King Solomon who built the temple as the center of worship for all prayers of the Israelite people. The temple was placed in what the Israelites considered the center of the universe, the center of their entire world. You really can't call them Jews at this point. Israelite and Israelite religion are more appropriate. But for all that, we get the Temple of Solomon, also known as the First Temple. According to the biblical account, the unified kingdom of Israel split into two kingdoms, Israel to the north, Judah to the south. Jerusalem remained the capital of the kingdom of Judah. Everything plugged along pretty well until the Assyrian Empire came barreling through. In approximately 586 BCE, the first temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. Most of the inhabitants were taken into exile into Mesopotamia, booted out into the countryside, or otherwise killed as this group of Mesopotamian armies, Assyrians, Babylonians, you name it, they did what they were famous for. Now, we've only scratched the surface of the first temple. We haven't even discussed the layout or anything like that, but you get the big picture. Much of the documentary history of the first Jewish temple is shrouded in layers of history mythologized and mythology historicized, but we're moving into an area with differing sources and multiple sources that we can start to compare these different sources with the sources in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. Let's talk about conquest, destruction, exile, and ultimately rebuilding. We start off with the Babylonian exile or captivity, and this is a fascinating period. It started or kick-started the diaspora of Judeans around the ancient world. The religion would develop many different ideas with contact with other cultures and religion, not only in the Mesopotamian area, but in Anatolia and in Egypt, and even in Greece to a certain lesser degree at this point. The exile sets up some interesting conflicts inside of the Israelite religion that we can explore in later episodes and later series. Some great literature came out of this time period or was inspired by this Babylonian captivity time period. In many ways, the exilic period is what transformed Israelites into Jews. The genesis of Second Temple Judaism came out of this time period, even before there was a physical Second Temple. After about 70 to 80 years, the Persians conquered Mesopotamia into the Levant and beyond. The Persians, on paper at least, were more enlightened than the Assyrians or the Babylonians or any of the groups before them. When Cyrus the Great, or Kurush the Great, and company came to town, they let the Judeans and Jews living in exile, or at least some of them, go back to Judea. Of course, some did take up Cyrus on the offer, but others chose to stay, and that's only natural, really. We're talking about people 2 to 3 generations after they had been exiled, who they'd been living in Babylon that whole time and established themselves. They were born, they lived, they prospered in Babylon. These exiles were generally the upper crust of Judean society to begin with, and they did pretty well for themselves living in Babylon, in these super cosmopolitan cities, some of the most cosmopolitan in the world. The portrayal of the Persians from the movie 300 isn't completely off base, at least in the big picture. There were no attack rhinos. There were no 10-foot tall golden god kings with bald heads. They're generally portrayed as having beautiful, long, curled hair and beards. And there weren't any orc-looking soldiers wielding double katanas. What 300 got close was that the Persians were not micromanagers as long as the local population paid nice. They paid taxes and they bent the knee, like they were showing in 300, that you would accept the Shah as the Shah of all Shahs. So the Persian king is the king of kings. Some groups obviously didn't play nice, such as the Egyptians and the Greeks. They were always a thorn in the side of the Persians. The Judeans took to the Persian way completely, though. Groups of Babylonian Jews went back to the southern Levant, Judea area with a mission and the full support of the Persians. The big shot Judeans from Babylon came back and got right to rebuilding the husk of Jerusalem. They got to building and rebuilding the temple. This is documented greatly in the book of the minor prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. See Gary Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast and my series on the 12 minor prophets for much more detail. The portrayal in the 12 minor prophets is fairly historically accurate. Other books of the Old Testament document this time period as well. By 515 BCE, the Second Temple of Jerusalem was built. According to several Old Testament canonical and apocryphal texts, this construction was done by Judean governor Zerubbabel or Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is another character like Melchizedek who gets many mentions in the Old Testament, but I don't think he's nearly as well known as he should be. He was almost certainly descendant of David and many of the kings of the Judean kingdom, and may very well have been an ancestor of Christ himself. The culture and religion of the Second Temple Jewish people and Judaism grew and developed over the next centuries or two. Some of the great written works were produced at this time. They were compiled, redacted, moved around into that great anthology we know as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. A new religion, or what we could say is new religions, developed, that of the Second Temple Judaism. The roots of modern Judaism and Christianity were really being built at this time, along with many different sects, many different theologies, and many different philosophies were swirling around. They were influenced by their neighbors, older traditions, and building their own traditions. Things were going along pretty well again. Then Alexander the Great rolls through. In some future episodes, we'll get into a lot more detail about the impact of Alexander the Great and Hellenism on Second Temple Judaism and the area of Judea and the southern Levant. This time period of post-Alexander the Great is where the great Septuagint translation of the Hebrew texts, not one text, but texts, into Greek happened. The Judea area in the southern Levant was, for a long time, the borderland between the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucids. Eventually, Judea fell completely into Seleucid territory. There was a major revolt by rigorist traditionalist elements in Judean society called the Maccabean Revolt. The short story is the temple was defiled by the Greeks, pigs slaughtered in the high places, statues of the gods placed in the temple. Big revolt, and Jerusalem was recaptured or reconquered or conquered again initially, or just flat out conquered by the Maccabeans. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. The Second Temple was rededicated with a tiny fraction of holy oil that was really required for the job, and we get Hanukkah. A Jewish Judean kingdom came out of this revolt and lasted for over 80 years. This Jewish Judean Hasmonean kingdom expanded its border and influence throughout the entire southern Levant, even beyond the borders of the ancient unified kingdom of Israel. The temple expanded architecturally and in theological importance. The temple became an institutional powerhouse. The Hasmonean kingdom began to falter, though. They had close relations with the Romans for a long time. The Romans came into the territory to bolster the Hasmoneans, and then the Hasmoneans turned into client kings of the Romans, and then finally the area of the Hasmonean kingdom became official Roman provinces. This process really upset a lot of people. The Hasmoneans had gone full circle from Jewish rigorists to Greco-Roman puppets. A theme of apocalypticism we see it really developed in Second Temple Judaism, and it was a real marker of Second Temple Judaism. One sect after another thought that a great priest king, an anointed one, a Messiah, a Christos, would come to save them from yet another foreign domination. You can see where that pattern of thought would come from. Melchizedek, he's the Jerusalem-based priest king. Powerful kings of a united Israelite kingdom build a wondrous temple. That temple's destroyed. Then a great king anointed by God, Cyrus the Great of Persia, delivered the Israelites and helped rebuild their temple. The Israelite Judean temple and people became strong again and grew until another foreign invader came and defiled and desecrated the temple. The Maccabees, these hammerers, completely defeat this foreign enemy that would mock the one true God. They rededicated the temple to God. Now the latest group of invaders and occupiers hit the scene, the Romans. The Romans mocked the temple and God. Another savior will come, another Messiah will come to free the land and restore the Jewish people to their rightful place. That is a really tight narrative if you think about it. You can see why the people would deeply believe in this whole ideology of that there's going to be a time where there's going to be a physical and a spiritual resurrection of Jerusalem. To get back to the Romans for a second, though, the theme that's running in parallel with this idea of apocalypticism inside of Judaism's. The Romans did what Romans do. They were in this place for conquest and riches, and the Levant then and now is an incredibly wealthy area. There's trade routes, there's products, there's farmland, there's cities. The Romans wanted things to be as calm as they could make them so that they could make coin. The Romans didn't use quite the soft approach that the Persians or the Ptolemies would. If you went along, the Romans could be fairly light on the ground. If not, though, and not to the degree, like if you're just getting along, you're really pushing the issue, the Romans didn't like the issue being pushed really at all. And if you did push the issue, they flooded the zone in the new speak. They put in troops, they put in tough governors, they did the whole thing. Many of these Second Temple Jewish groups were not in it to go along to get along. The regions of the southern Levant were in constant turmoil at one level of intensity to the next, from a low boil to boiling over for decades, from the BCs all the way into the Common Era. Finally, the region exploded into full-blown revolt. Many generals would make big names for themselves and even become emperors themselves. People would write down the stories of bravery and treachery on all sides. In April of 70 AD, the Romans laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. By September, it was all over. Jerusalem was razed to the ground, including the Second Temple. Only pieces of the massive foundation remained. The hopes and the prayers that the Jewish rebels could defeat the gigantic empire just one more time did not play out. There would be more revolts in the future decades. People really just trying to recreate that old magic, that old time religion of the Maccabees. It just wasn't meant to be. The destruction of the temple completely rocked Second Temple Judaism. How do you have a second temple Jewish sect without a temple, that was a major problem. Different groups handled it differently. Most of the sectarian groups just faded away. Two big groups would come out of the destruction of the second temple: the Christians and the Pharisees, who would become the proto-rabbinical Jews and then eventually the rabbinical Jews. Now, this was just a really high flyover of the temple, just to situate ourselves for future episodes and to give us more to think about previous episodes, really going back all the way to day one, episode one. There is so much more we can get into. We can talk about how these groups were able to adjust to the fall of the second temple, how Jewish and Christians alike think about a new temple, and if a third temple should even be built. The archaeology of a temple, which I think I'm going to do that one very soon, so keep your feeds tuned in for that. What happened after the fall of the temple? Immediately after the temple, as well as long term? What were the liturgical practices of the temple? And how did these practices evolve and change and stay the same from the first temple to the second temple to the post-temple? And then what were the day-to-day happenings in and around the temple? If there is a topic related to the first or the second temple or the post-temple of Jerusalem, reach out through X, email, Facebook, or whatever you prefer, and let's just talk about this. I love it, and it's one of my favorite topics, and I will talk to you next time.